Hi everyone, and welcome again to the next part on the Major Arcana. In this video, we're going to be talking about Arcanum number 3, the Empress. Okay, so the Empress is the Empress is another one of these very interesting cards because the Empress is the path that connects Chokhmah to Binah, the number 2 to the number 3, uh, basically wisdom to understanding. So it is the union between the masculine, archetypal masculine aspect of God and the archetypal feminine aspect of God. And she is the planet Venus and the letter Daleth. Daleth means door, essentially, or opening. And so this is why we have this very obvious background that is opened up. She's situated in kind of an arch. Um, because she is basically the womb of life. This is how we sometimes get the Earth Mother meaning for the Empress. She is the mother of all life. And the idea is entirely about love with the whole Venus aspect. Uh, the interesting thing about this card, I think, right from the bat, is that Crowley tells us in his book that there is no other card in which it is more important to concentrate on one single idea. That all of them can have multivalent meanings and purposes, but that the Empress really only represents one thing. Which I think is really interesting that he should make that point. And he basically says that that point of the card is love. Now, the idea of love that he's talking about uh, is, of course, very uh, high up there because it is the last trump that has anything to do with the supernal triangle, Keter, Chokhmah, and Binah. And so, of course, it's going to be one of these more esoteric cards, not as much as the first three, the Fool, the Magus, and the Priestess, because those all come from Keter, and I think because Keter is so ineffable, it really is difficult to talk about those cards. Um, but basically, the Empress is a little lower down, and again connects the mother to the or the father to the mother, vice versa. And it's the first reciprocal path we have, basically, in which the because it's horizontal, we say that the interaction between the two forces is an interchange, basically. Um, Sorry, I don't know if you can hear my cat. He's being really bad, driving me nuts. Um, so it's more about mutual force as opposed to the other paths where it's more clearly, in the case of the Magus, it's very clearly the influence of Keter upon Binah. Keter is the active force, Binah is the passive force in that case. Whereas in this case, both of them, both Chokhmah and Binah in this case, 2 and 3, are both active and receptive equally. So this is very interesting. But the idea is, of course, because these are our first ideas of polarity, masculine versus feminine, active versus passive, hot versus cold, all of these things, because this is our first dichotomy in the universe according to the Sephiroth, the fact that the Empress joins them tells us that all dichotomies at their root are designed to be attracted to each other and are meant to be dissolved in each other, essentially. The idea of love is one of totality, really, because the symbol for Venus in esoteric writings, you often read about how Venus is the one of the most important astrological symbols, also the symbol for femininity, of course, um, but it's because it is the one astrological symbol that can connect every Sephirah on the Tree of Life, basically. And if you find yourself a diagram of the Tree of Life, you can very easily draw the circle with the cross, and you will have touched every Sephirah. So this is, of course, led to one of these esoteric doctrines that the universe is love. Um, this is kind of confusing to talk about because everyone has a different idea of what love is. And if you are a Westerner, having been exposed to centuries-old ideas of courtly love and Christian concepts, Judeo-Christian concepts of love, love, excuse me, for us tends to be all about self-sacrifice. Giving up what you want, excuse me, for the love of someone else. Basically debilitating oneself for the love of someone else. But the Empress, even though she is very feminine, again, we were talking about how the paths are both active and passive. Love requires both things, basically. That love requires activity and passivity on the part of both participants, basically. Um, One cannot be more active or more passive than the other because love is about equilibrium. And love is about equality, basically. The idea is that love is that which is able to dissolve any opposite back into its original unity. And of course, that unity is unmanifest in Keter. It's ambiguous, it's nothing, really. It's back into an idea of zero, really. Um, so love is also death in many ways. Love is also binding and dissolving. It's very interesting that it should be as such, but um, it's got a lot of alchemical connotations, as you can imagine, for that reason. And this is why perhaps he connects it to alchemy through saying that she is also representative of the symbol of salt, or rather the essence of salt. And this is why her arms are doing this little circle with the line down it. This is the symbol for salt in alchemy. Um, Salt is associated with femininity, stagnation, and death. And I know that sounds very bleak, and I apologize if you're a woman listening to this. It really is not meant to be offensive, I think. You can be offended by it if you wish. Uh, but I don't think it's necessarily meant to be offensive. Of course, misogynist thinkers throughout the centuries have turned it into something offensive, but I think in the modern era we can just say that it's a necessary opposite. Um, that if you're going to have an active force, then you need a passive force to complement it. You need the extremes in order to create existence, basically. Um, because if there were no separation of things, existence couldn't be. This is getting back to the Magus and stuff, and the Magus talking about how the Magus organizes existence into separate things, but that those separate forms are really illusions. But you could not have manifested existence if you didn't have the idea of us versus them or me versus you. Because if you and I were the same thing, then how could we claim separate existences from each other? We would both see each other as kind of, I think, well, it would be the equivalent of God, basically. It would be returned back into zero, and therefore, I mean, the idea is that because God is everything, the only way for God to create something um, of any real uh, motion or integrity, I guess, is by creating something that understands itself to be separate from something else. Because God sees itself as one with all of its creations, and so therefore it can never experience what it can possibly be. So this is why the fool represents, the babe Harpocrates, and the babe in the blue egg and all that stuff. Because he's never going to experience things because he's fully unattached to existence and cannot separate himself from anything else. From God's perspective, everything is the same thing, is essentially what we're getting at. So in order to create a universe that can actually function, you need to create beings that consider themselves as separate so that they can experience and grow and keep the universe in motion and thereby perpetuate existence. Because if existence really were all about stagnation, salt, it would be death. It would die and would not exist. The law of thermodynamics tells us this, that if ever the universe reaches absolute zero, uh, everything will end, basically. That's kind of the ultimate apocalypse if the universe doesn't crunch before then, or whatever is going to happen to the sucker. Um, so yes, so the Empress really has a lot going on. You know, going back to the fact that she's the door, she's the doorway to life, but she's also the door to death. And this is what Binah is getting at as well. Because Binah is the womb, and Binah is the first idea of duality. Remember, we talked about in the previous video, we talked about how Binah is God, not God. God is the idea of that which is not God, and therefore it's associated with form because God has no definitive form. So as such, being the mother of form, she is the mother of life, but things that must live must also die and be subject to duality and existence in duality. So this is also why salt is relevant here. And pregnancy as well. Pregnancy takes a very long time. The idea that fertility in life is a slow process. The growth of life is a slow process. So this is also connected to her salt aspect. I would like to talk a little bit about the pelican in the corner, because this symbol in this card is that which interests me the most. Um, the pelican in medieval Christian uh, iconography is a symbol of Christ. The pelican was believed in medieval bestiaries, probably the one from St. Isidore of Seville, kind of the first big encyclopedia person, really, and of course totally wrong. I mean, half of his information was incredibly incorrect and based on fantasy. But he says, and this is one of them, that the pelican is an animal, or someone says in the Middle Ages, I'm just using Isidore as an example, but it was believed in the Middle Ages that the pelican fed its young by using the blood of its own heart, really. So in medieval iconography, you sometimes see these pelicans that are ripping at their own breasts with their beaks, and then feeding their young with it. And it's, of course, very violent and kind of distasteful. But the idea was that Christ's passion executed the same thing, that through the pain and trauma and bloodletting of the passion, Christ has fed us all spiritually. And you know, Christ is the manna from heaven, the bread from heaven. I am the bread of life. All those things are connected to this idea of the pelican and feeding, spiritual feeding with oneself. Um, so in this card, in the Empress card, it's very interesting that Crowley should include it in Lady Frida Harris, because it is something that usually had this. It of course is a very maternal symbol, but it's also a masculine symbol as well, being associated with Christ. And so we have, again, this fusion of masculine and feminine principles contained here. Um, but the idea, I think, is more that um, kind of getting back to the priestess about how God is the truth behind form. The idea, I think, is that, you know, being connected to Chokhmah, that God's unlimited force and unlimited creative potential is rationed out to manifested beings, basically. That we have our existence because God gives of his own body. And it's not necessarily the manifested God. This is a loftier level of sacrifice. And it's not even sacrifice because there's no pain involved in it. There's no real destructive element yet in the Empress. So, so again, it's going almost above and beyond the Christian principle of the pelican and self-sacrifice, because you know that one is much more about the salvation of the world coming down to one individual, and that one individual having to endure endless trials and awful tribulations. Whereas this is more the idea that we all partake in God's body, basically, and owe our being and our sustenance and our spiritual immortality to God. And that because we are all children of God, we are therefore able to eventually unify with God and recognize the totality of universal consciousness. And again, that gets back to love. So even though it seems that I've talked about a bunch of different things here, really they all circulate around this idea of love and the entire universe being love. So again, love is a very complicated concept when we're talking about divine love. Um, but it knows no bounds, and that's something very beautiful and inspiring as well. When people want to classify love as, for instance, being between only a man and a woman, or just anything along those lines. I mean, divine love is such that it cannot be contained by any categories, really. Um, and that's important. If human love is supposed to echo divine love, really, then how do we reconcile the difference between the two, basically? It's kind of impossible. I think either there's something wrong with human love, or or what we believe human love to really be. This kind of self-sacrificing BS, in my opinion. Um, then then that's very much not what divine love is about. And then we cannot say things like, you know, as the Catholic Church teaches, the institution of marriage is the reflection of God's love, of divine love. It doesn't make sense if you look at what divine love actually is. Of course, you can debate whether or not this is what divine love is, because, of course, I'm getting this from Kabbalah and general Western esotericism, and also some Christian aspects, but not so much. Um, so yeah, obviously this is at this point a matter of opinion, but that's what the card is getting at. Um, yeah, basically. That's also the idea behind the fleur de lis on the bottom of the card, the symbol of royalty. It's the idea that if God is also king of the universe and we are all his children, then we are all equally co-heirs of the kingdom of heaven, basically. We are all equally royal. We all have royal blood in us, basically. So, of course, this is a very beautiful concept as well. Um, and can also represent why we need to respect each other and love each other. So this is a very deep card, as they all are. But I hope you found it interesting, helpful. If you have anything to say, add, comments, questions, leave them in the comments down below. Thank you very much, and I'll see you for the Emperor at another day. Okay? Bye.